Hi, everybody. This is Samir Chopra, Professor of Philosophy at Brooklyn College and Philosophical Counselor. I am here to engage in a conversation with my good friend, John Tambornino, who is also a fellow philosophical counselor, and will be joining me for a conversation on our nation's present racial crisis and what the tools of philosophy, philosophical counseling, and philosophical reflection can offer us. John has taught ethics and public policy at Brown University and taught at New York University, Western Washington University, and Johns Hopkins. His scholarly interests are broad and diverse, ranging across politics, political science, public policy, philosophy as a way of life. In the last couple of weeks, John, you've written on your blog, Larger Questions, a series of what I consider very thoughtful and reflective posts on our nation's racial crisis and on the role that philosophy and philosophical counseling can play in this. So one of the things I want to try and do with you today is to ask you perhaps a series of questions about those blogs, and I'm hoping, of course, that our listeners will chase down the blogs themselves, that'll ask you to perhaps further reflect on those questions and to perhaps enter into a dialogue with me here, critical and sympathetic both. So here's one of the first questions I wanted to ask you. So in recent times, when our nation was experiencing what one might describe as a fairly serious amount of civil unrest in response to our acute racial crisis, what made you think of philosophy, or what led you to philosophy as a way of responding to this crisis? And why do you think in this very charged, frenzied, one would say almost hectic environment, that something like calm, reflective, philosophical thinking was an appropriate approach to it?
Excellent question, Samir, and thank you for this opportunity to have a dialogue. I've really been looking forward to it. I think I have several responses to that question. The first response, and it's the least interesting, so I'll spend the least time on it, is that philosophy for me is a form of consolation, in the sense that it brings me real peace, just the calm and the quiet and the focus of philosophical study, of reflection, of unhurried dialogue with others. So in some ways, regardless of the stress in my life or the angst or the sadness or whatever else, philosophy is something that really just kind of restores me and revitalizes me and just brings me back to myself and just gives me a clarity and a strength and replenishes me. So that's the first reason why I make time every day really for philosophy, and I found that especially important in the midst of this crisis that you were describing, of just the tremendous, the intensity of it, really, that was overwhelming us. That's the first thing. What I would want to emphasize more is my reaction to the crisis and what I observed. And so, like so many people, most people, with the civil unrest that resulted from a spate of violence and murders and injustices, most visibly with George Floyd, I was shocked, I was saddened, I was outraged, I was just really overwhelmed by it, and I couldn't think of anything else. And everyone I knew was in the same state of being overwhelmed and just deeply distressed. And I was observing a lot of protests, participating some of them myself, certainly discussing it a lot, reading. And my impression was that all around me was philosophy. Right? So rather than this notion that it's what I do early in the morning to get ready for the day, or rather than it being something that when the smoke clears, we engage in philosophy, or something even worse that only a few more privileged people and properly educated people can do, that philosophy was just pervading this environment. The reason it was pervading the environment is that here we were suddenly struck with this glaring injustice and this powerful sense that something is deeply wrong and we need to correct something, and correct something profound about just the way our society is organized, the nature of our relationships to one another. That is to say, everyone was stopping and saying, what is the nature of our society fundamentally? What is my position in it fundamentally? What is my conduct? What do my actions contribute to? What are we doing collectively now, and what ought we to be doing? Ultimately, what sort of society do we want? That is to say, the questions that are the essence of moral and political philosophy is what all of us were wrestling with constantly.
Yep.
And those of us standing on the sidewalk with signs, as I was several times, chanting and whatever else, we're insisting on social change, and that's it. We were doing philosophy,
Yep.
Saying what the nature of justice was and what a just society would look like. And it's not the first crisis I've experienced, of course, in my life, but I was noticing more this time than ever before how this protest and this concern was so pervasively philosophical and inextricably philosophical. And that led me then to just begin to really move beyond these distinctions we normally have, that philosophy is inherently abstract with no connection to, with no real practical application, that philosophy is a luxury that a few of us do when we have real leisure, that philosophy is inherently esoteric, such that only a few people really have the business doing it. All of those seem to not apply. Philosophy was abstract, but as practical as could be. It wasn't a luxury, but it was an absolute necessity. And it wasn't esoteric. It had been democratized in the sense that every person of every age and every color was doing philosophy, and they couldn't avoid doing it.
Yeah. You know, I was just thinking when you were talking about protests and standing on sidewalks and holding signs, I thought even political slogans that people shout out at rallies, they are very much often statements of political axioms and principles. You know, the simple call, no justice, no peace.
Right.
It is a statement of a philosophical thesis that in a society that has not found a just way of governing itself, there will be no peace either. And I think that can very, very well serve as a kind of an axiom for a foundational work of political philosophy. I can very well imagine, you know, some academic philosopher writing a book called, whose title is No Justice, No Peace, and putting forward a theory of justice that explains the relationship between a just society and the amount of social unrest it experiences. I think there is a sense in which, because we haven't found American racial justice, we haven't found American social peace either. Yeah. So I think that's a very good way. One way to think about it is, I remember saying this in defense of some student activists in Brooklyn College a few years ago, who were brought up on disciplinary charges for disrupting a faculty meeting by shouting slogans. And I defended them. I said, these students are putting political philosophy into practice. We should be praising them. We should be finding out why is it that they have turned to political activism? What are the problems that are actually bringing them out into the streets, rather than rushing to censure them or discipline them. I said, we teach all these students political philosophy. Now they're putting it into practice, and you want us to punish them?
Right. So, right. It's obviously they might have been doing it in a somewhat overexcited way, but they were practicing academic freedom, it sounds like, and engaging in dialogue. I would just say to put a point on what I was saying earlier, that, and yes, so I do hope that the 300-page academic treatise entitled No Justice, No Peace, No Justice, or No Justice, No Peace, rather, is published. But what I want to emphasize now, and what just excites me so much, is the 17-year-old on the sidewalk holding that sign is a philosopher.
Yeah.
She's doing philosophy.
Yes, exactly.
And then the question is, it's always a matter of degree. Yes, through thinking more and talking more and reading more, hopefully her understanding would become more complex, more nuanced. Yeah. And that's part of philosophy. So it's not that she's holding the sign and she's done.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe one way to think of it, she's holding the sign and she's starting.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And
formulating her views and presenting them and engaging in dialogue.
Yeah. And I think in many ways, in being able to draw upon philosophical resources, from varied traditions that could supply her with one might call conceptual tools, supply them with historical and conceptual knowledge, because very often the next stage after street protests is to engage in processes of negotiation, contestation. And in those spaces, you require arguments, you require facts, you require the ability to put certain concepts up for play and to redefine them. And I think, as we'll notice later in this discussion, one of the terms up for redefinition is the very term police itself. And of course, terms like race themselves come up for redefinition. And one of the things that philosophy specializes in is the definition and the reclarification of these concepts. All activism calls for theory and praxis. So I think
You know, that leads me to a question I'd like to pose to you. And I'm thinking that there may be an irony or a tension, but maybe there's not, given the way you're explaining yourself now. And that is, like me, I know from prior discussions, you've been tremendously affected by the past several weeks, just profoundly disturbed and activated, mobilized by the injustices that have just really come to light so clearly. And you come at this on a number of levels, really. And you're a person of color, you're an immigrant to the US, you're a father of a daughter who may be facing or may already face perhaps forms of discrimination, you're a citizen, you're teaching in one of the most diverse colleges in the country, living in the most diverse city in the US. So there's Samir, the person, the father, the citizen, who's reacting very strongly to these injustices and feels very strongly that certain changes are simply necessary. And there's Samir, the philosopher, and who you've devoted your professional life to philosophy. And what philosophies do is, including some of the things you were just describing, they elucidate concepts, they refine concepts, that sort of thing, refine principles. But fundamentally, what philosophers are most able to do, I believe, is to understand, of course, the reasons for a position, but the limitations of any position, the weaknesses, the arguments that can be brought against it, to understand alternative positions, including antithetical positions in some cases, and to understand the reasons that could be made, presented for those alternative positions. And usually that philosophical just awareness of complexity and often the limited validity of a particular claim leads one to kind of a modesty or a hesitation, sometimes even paralysis, of course. So what I'd like you to think about is whether I'm right. Is there a tension between Samir the citizen and Samir the philosopher in terms of insisting on certain changes, but then also knowing that good people and smart people would disagree with you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that word you use, tension, is interesting, because I think there is a tension, but I think the tension is I would call it virtuous one. It's creative tension. Because I think there is, besides the perspective that you mentioned of being able to come to hold opposing viewpoints, take them on, try them out for size, as it were, take the other person's perspective, because now I have the sort of conceptual and intellectual tools with which to do so. But I think at the same time, there is another aspect that philosophy also introduces to this picture, which I think bears on some earlier conversations that we've had, that very often the effect of introducing philosophy into a particular political response to a situation can be to understand just how weak and incoherent several apparently well-established positions are, and to coming to understand what, in fact, their ideological sort of burden has been. And I think that, in a sense, can be, you can watch entire edifices of thought crumble before you, because all of a sudden you realize that the positions that they have founded themselves on are untenable.
Right.
So I think just like I think philosophy enables me to take on certain positions sympathetically, it also gives me a certain kind of, sometimes what I call a kind of a universal acid for dissolving foundations. yeah, I suddenly find out that the pillars on which these systems have been erected are, rather weaker than what I had imagined, that their feet are made of sand, so to speak. So I think the tension is a creative one. I have strong, powerful, emotional, affective responses, but I think in many parts, those strong, powerful, emotional, affective responses have come about precisely because I am a philosopher. I would say that, in fact, coming into contact with many species of political philosophy for me was in fact a kind of awakening, not in the sense of making me more, as it were, tranquil, but firing me up, so to speak. So for example, when I first encountered feminist thought in 28 years ago, formal feminist thought, and I read its critiques of the social contract, and I read critiques of theories of justice, and I read critiques of Kantian ethics. The effect on me was that I suddenly realized that that I, as a brown man, had much more in common with white women than I had imagined previously. And that so clearly I had taken on an alternative position. I had found myself being able to understand the feminist viewpoint, but my taking on the feminist viewpoint was not something which made me calmer. It was suddenly something that made me realize that a grave injustice was not just being committed right now. It enabled me to view my past relationships with my mother, my grandmother. I suddenly realized that these women in my life had been feminists, that they had been fighting these battles on their own, that maybe they didn't use a theoretical framework to explain themselves, but that their actions and statements that they were decidedly feminist. So I do think that, philosophy does enable this role in which we can take on alternative viewpoints and as a result obtain much greater sympathy and empathy. But at the same time, I think because philosophy gives us these critical tools, which is why we have critical theory as such an important species of philosophy, or what one might call genealogical philosophy, like Foucault and Nietzsche. Where did this all come from? Cui bono? Who is this benefiting? These sorts of subversive philosophical investigations, as you see in Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx, what Paul Ricoeur called the hermeneutics of suspicion. You're sort of sniffing out what's wrong here. Why do people seem so comfortable with all these things? What is up? And I think that aspect of philosophy is also something that fascinates me, which is that we are able to, I think at times, cut through cant and pretension and I would say ideological, glibness in a sense. So I think insofar as those earlier parts of my personality that you describe as having, I think they are me, but I think they also bear the stamp of my philosophical education. So my position as an immigrant, as a person of color, as a father, they're all philosophically tinged. And very often it is that of a kind of critical tinge that I have found certain tools in philosophy which now enable me to investigate certain pre-established presuppositions of the world around me with greater rigor and skepticism as well.
That's so helpful. And I'm realizing that implicit in my question was kind of an imbalance in that it's true that philosophy can undercut or at least seriously scrutinize the demands of, say, the protesters, regardless of what they're protesting and when. But similarly, the status quo often can be kind of exposed, the weaknesses, the intellect, as you say, there's sort of the creaky foundations themselves. So, and to that extent, you get an interesting sort of dynamic that it's true. There's serious arguments that can be made against the protesters and their assumptions, but the defenders of the status quo are often no less vulnerable to that.
Yes.
So I think we move into an interesting space. Of acknowledging, and you're sort of moving inherently sort of to a form of democratic deliberation. Where there's that mutual recognition. Of the the objections that could be brought to one's own position, and then the need for some sort of deliberation and compromise often regarding that. So.
And I think history has a very good role to play out here, because those who are in the protest movements and those who are spectators or critics of this interaction between the protesters and those that are entrenched in power or those that are commenting on it, we realize as well, ideology works in particular ways. So for example, the insistence that protests be cast in particular molds that it follows certain channels of thought, that this form of protest is inappropriate and that this one should be followed. You know, the history of philosophical thought and the history of political thought shows us that in fact these responses are old ones. They are in fact often reactionary ones, because they want protests to be diffused and to be, as it were, you know, I think of protests as great streams of rushing water, energy, and what this response that is saying that the protests take on certain forms is a kind of a channeling into these sort of placid bywaters where the energy of the protests can be dissipated, and it will lose its affective charge, and it'll disappear into a sea of sort of banalities and cliches, which we have used to dispense with protests in the past. So I think this mixture, and I think maybe history and philosophy put together have a particularly potent contribution to make to this particular debate. You know, that mention of history, and I think you've already, in some ways, we have already moved on past this question. So let me ask you a question that is now sort of flowing out of this discussion that we found ourselves in. You know, you've claimed in your blogs, and I think it's present in the first post and it's present in the second one as well, that an important role that philosophy can play in this present situation is to formulate and clarify and articulate what the goals of the protests are. For example, you know, witness the considerable confusion, whether it's deliberate or innocent, about what defund the police and abolish the police mean. So how do you think the philosophical insights and quote unquote rigor, so to speak, could contribute clarity, depth, and strength to what, you know, you and I might agree are the valid demands of protesters? And does philosophy also temper these demands?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think we've begun to speak to it. I do think that, I would emphasize that, I mean, it's not so much in the formal sense, but in the more general sense, I'm a skeptic by nature. And I'm always cognizant, or wish to be cognizant, of the limitations of any perspective or belief, set of principles, and the like. And to me then, and I like to think of myself as someone who's appreciative of complexity and is not wanting to diminish just complexity, including when thinking about these social political matters that we're talking about. And so to me, what philosophy can introduce, which, as we've been saying, is already there by everyone on the street, and for that matter, the people who are denouncing the protesters are engaging in a form of philosophy through the claims they're making.
Yes.
And their defense of the status quo in many cases. So what ultimately, where philosophy leads me in that kind of situation, and where I would hope it would lead others, is toward an increasing recognition of complexity, toward increasing nuance, toward acknowledgement that there's no single right position, often, that there's at least a multiplicity of perspectives, not all of which are, of course, I don't mean to be creating some sort of false equivalence, but there's almost always more than one that's got real validity and power, right? And they're not identical. To me, it's the rare situation where one simply cannot imagine more than one perspective that has anything to be said for it.
Yeah.
So this leads me in two related directions. One is in a direction of democracy, in the sense of a diverse collective engaging in dialogue and deliberation and eventually compromise, because they're recognizing that different perspectives have something to say, that they're complementing one another often, and there's a completeness that comes through this multiplicity of perspectives. And that leads one ideally in the direction of compromise, partly out of necessity, that I believe democracy is in part premised on this covenant, really, this social contract, that we've got to live together. We're going to govern ourselves, and that requires trusting one another, and that's going to require compromising with one another. That's the only way it's going to work.
Yeah.
And so to me, if one is appreciating and emphasizing this multiplicity of perspectives, and there's kind of an ethos of some degree of modesty and humility, to me that sends us toward dialogue and deliberation and prepares us for comfort with a certain amount of compromise. Once that's how we're viewing what our own beliefs and then viewing what it is we're doing in being democratic citizens. And the other thing I would emphasize that's related to that is philosophy in helping us understand complexity. And there's many reasons for complexity, but one reason for complexity is that you've got just inherent sort of paradoxes and conceptual sorts of antitheses and whatnot that are, and value clashes that are kind of underway. There's other reasons for complexity, just the nature of society, that I think that eventually leads us in kind of a pragmatic direction, in the loosest sense of realizing that, okay, when the protests end and we're setting about reforming police departments, well, what do we do? Well, we're not exactly sure what they're going to look like. We're not exactly sure what these new institutions and authorities are going to look like. And even the stuff that we were insisting on may not work out in practice. So there's going to be just this experimental approach. It's going to take on a somewhat empirical quality of just trying out different kinds of reforms, different policies and whatnot. Karl Popper envisioned, for some related reasons, had this notion that he thought ultimately kind of public policy and governing and political science should be about what he called piecemeal social engineering, actually. And I don't like the sound of that for all kinds of reasons. It's much more too technocratic and it's too constraining. But very generally, that's where philosophy and my personal and professional experience lead me, toward an appreciation of complexity and toward, at some point, wanting to be in a more experimental mode of trying things and seeing what works and trying again and seeing what works. And I think then, once we're in that stage of the experimentation, that itself, one of the best sort of ethos to bring to that is one of humility and curiosity and open-mindedness. So that's a lot, but in short, that's at least what philosophy gives me as I participate in this, and what I believe it could give many more.
I want to pick up on something that is a kind of a subtext to what you're saying, and I'm going to pick up on a couple of points and say, first of all, the bit about perspectives, and I want to try and make it concrete by bringing in some language and some concepts of the recent crisis to try and make this clear. For example, you think of the slogan "Black Lives Matter," and you think of what is sometimes called a kind of a reactionary response to it, where people say all lives matter. And I would say that, in fact, the protester or the sloganeer who is raising the slogan "Black Lives Matter" is in fact saying that our current social perspectives do not include a perspective in which Black Lives Matter. And by raising this slogan, we want this to be a perspective that is included in our social lenses of concern and caring and empathy, whether it's in policing, whether it's in social policy, whether it's in education policy. Black Lives Matter. And if we have this kind of multifaceted view of American society, which is, as it were, made up of a composite of the perspectives of the different Americans who make up our nation, then the Black Lives Matter sloganeer is really saying, we want Black perspectives to be included in this picture. We want Black voices to be heard. We want Black sensitivities to be taken on board. I also think this is relevant to the debate that we have had about defunding the police or abolishing the police. These slogans are raised, and very often a kind of what I think sometimes the response might be, well, what do you mean? How could you possibly do this? And sometimes I think there is perhaps what I might call a lack of sympathetic nuance in that response, which is, what could they be trying to say given what their current problems are? And I think a philosophical lens that I bring to this is, look, first of all, what I'm hearing is a certain kind of, I don't want to call it a cry for help, but I do want to say that it is an expression that is very powerfully affectively loaded. That is, these words, defund and abolish, are being used to bring our attention to a situation that is so critical that people are almost people are willing to get rid of something that we think is the maintainer and the harbinger of law and order. So that serves not as a position for me to throw up my hands in puzzlement, but instead to say, why is it that you might be so angry? Why are you trying to defund and abolish the police? And then when I enter deeper and further into this inquiry and I find out what does defunding mean? What does abolition mean? And one of the things that I find out by defunding and abolition is that the protesters are asking for us to reconceptualize what we mean by police, to reconceptualize what we mean by policing, to in fact even reconceptualize what we mean by order and control. For example, is it really disorder if there are people begging on street corners, like, you know, the way the New York City police wanted to clarify and, you know, cleanse all the streets? And I think what happens is that when these, you know, and I think radical slogans are what philosophers should be interested in, because as the word radical suggests, they are getting to the root of the matter. And when a radical slogan is made, rather than saying, oh, come on, this slogan is so radical, it's, you know, it's beyond my comprehension, I would say rather as philosophers, our task is to sympathetically inquire into what affect has driven that radical slogan and what are the concepts that are up for play. We cannot continue to hold on to concepts with their old definitions and continue to make sense of radical slogans. Radical slogans require reconceptualization. And I think that reconceptualization is what will give us a kind of a new kaleidoscope of American life, because the perspectives that hang together will have different relationships to each other. They will fit together differently. Perhaps perspectives will be placed in different orientations with respect to each other. There's a kind of middle-class suburban perspective that we have on policing, you know, which are these friendly guys who drive around on our broad tree-lined streets and, you know, escort our kids who are walking home alone from school and who show up at our July 4th fireworks to, you know, soak in the reflected glory of this peaceful suburban community. These people are very different from the armed, hostile constabulary that functions as a kind of a counter-insurgent force in these neighborhoods of our cities. These two things are not the same. They are the same term is being used to describe them, but they're not the same thing. The people being policed are different. The people doing the policing are different. The relationship is different. To keep on using the same term for them is to commit a grave philosophical error. They're not the same thing. So if some suburban, you know, the so-called independent swing voter in a battleground states, hey, come on, my police are just, you know, the friendly sheriff down at the precinct. We're not talking about the same thing.
Right. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think a few things I'd say, can't do justice to that. I think there's one image then of the philosopher that hears the defund the police and then helps that person, that community, extend that further.
Yes.
And just further clarify and sharpen and complexify what we mean by that and how that the issues that raises in terms of order, governance, legitimacy, coercion, violence, those kinds of things. And just help think about the different directions one could go with defund the police and the issues and problems in some instances that presents. So that's one respect in which the philosopher is helper isn't the word, but it can sort of work with a community to understand the full significance, implications, and et cetera, and unanswered questions presented by, say, defund the police. It strikes me also that the philosopher can help the person who is defending the status quo, whether regarding policing or whatever else, to help understand, well, what is the position? What are the strongest arguments in favor of the status quo? For example, the current arrangements we have and policies we have regarding policing. Just that, what are the strongest arguments can be made? And what are the strongest foundations that can be put forth for it? And that's, of course, a very valuable intellectual exercise. Doing that, even if we're more on the other side, can lead us perhaps to change our thinking or become more sympathetic toward that, but can also help us say, well, what is the best justification for the status quo position? And then helps us say, well, then what's the reality? How far does that fall short from that?
Very true.
It probably takes us in a direction of social science then. of observing more carefully,
Yeah.
again, what is the reality relative to the ideal
Yeah.
for this? So, yeah.
I think there's two very good examples of the kind of social science inputs in this, and the kind of reflection on empirical realities. And sociologists who've been studying policing, of course, are this is the task they dedicate themselves to. And I think here's a couple of examples. For example, a very common response to abolishing the police or defunding the police is, well, wait a second, who's going to fight crime then?
Mm-hmm.
And we say, well, somebody will fight crime. As a society, we will fight crime.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, we might call the crime fighting people crime fighters. They will not be glorified social workers. They will not be people who will be called upon to attend to the mentally ill, to domestic violence, called into public schools to attend to truant kids. They're not the folks who are, I see the New York City police in my neighborhood in Brooklyn stopping in at bodegas in the morning to flush out school kids who are 10 minutes late going to school. And these are always kids of color. And, it's like so there's a sense in which perhaps the linkage between policing and controlling communities of color will be broke down. We will have crime fighting, but we will isolate that function and put it in crime fighting and divorce all these other functions and perhaps find other social solutions to them. For example, we are used to thinking of law and legal solutions as solutions to all disputes. But there are other solutions to disputes besides legal wrangling, arbitration, family counseling, friends coming together and helping people meet. And in fact, people rely on these kinds of conflict resolution scenarios all the time. And I think, one of the important inputs that has come out of critical legal studies is that there's a kind of an impoverishment of our imagination by the law. That we tend to think of society as something that is a legal construct, and in fact, it will only function when law is the the kind of binding force and the driving engine. But there are many other ways of handling societies, and maybe living in a legal society, maybe living in a police society, and by this I put quotes around these terms. It has, as it were, denuded our imagination, made it impossible for us to see landscapes that lie beyond. And sometimes what critical theory needs to do is to knock down the walls of the edifices and the structures that surround us so that we can see the great vistas that open up instead. There's a kind of a beautiful image that, in fact, C.S. Lewis uses when talking about Christianity. And he says, what if someone was to come and give you a beautiful painting? And this beautiful painting did not fit inside any existing structures of buildings that you had. You might decide that the painting itself was so beautiful that you wanted to demolish the existing structures to make way for the visions that presented to you. Now, he, of course, is speaking of religious thought and religious belief. But there is something similar there that in a certain sense is an introduction to a radical way of believing something, making this radical step of faith. And I think in political activism, when we encounter radical political thought, we are being asked to enter into zones where, in fact, the older concepts that we have are placed under a certain amount of strain. And we might have to make these, as it were, decisions and deliberations on how tightly we want to hold on to these older concepts when it is their reconceptualization that is being asked for.
Right. That's so rich. And there's another question I'd like to pose to you, but before that, let me just offer an observation so the first political philosopher is Socrates, and what he does is so relevant to what we're talking about, is confronts people and asks them to justify common sense beliefs, to justify status quo institutions, and in just about every instance, they're unable to fully do so. In the process of doing so, they unearth and lay bare all kinds of assumptions and problems and whatnot that they were just not aware of. They were in a dogmatic sort of state. And so it just seems like so much of what you are emphasizing truly goes back to the founding of moral and political philosophy. And that was in part this scrutinizing of the status quo.
Yes.
And at least saying, if we are going to stick with the status quo, at least be able to articulate an explanation and a justification for why we're committed to it. And be aware of what the alternatives are and be able to, again, explain why the alternatives are inferior to the status quo. And if they're not, of course, explain why it is we wouldn't pursue one of the alternatives. So just that. I mean, what you're saying couldn't be more contemporary, and in some ways it couldn't be more ancient.
Yeah. And the only dispute I would put forward as a way of contesting something you said of Socrates being the first political philosopher, I would say there are
in the West.
Yes, I would say that kind of hidden indexical, so to speak, is always necessary. That, of course, there in the Chinese and the Indian traditions, rich traditions of political philosophers, often, in the classical position of being advisors to kings and kingdoms and offering them what I might call a certain sort of, in the case of Confucius and Mengzi, a kind of species of virtue ethics. And I think in the Indian political tradition, I would say a certain species of political realism, as in the work of Kautilya and others, which is grounded in thinking of political actors not as abstract, right-bearing bundles, but as highly situated agents located in particular times and places and bearing very powerful personal ties to others around them. And so, this kind of, this kind of psychological tradition that is present in, for example, Hobbes, Spinoza, and Machiavelli, you can find traces of that in Indian and Chinese political philosophy. There's something else I wanted to say before we wrap up our conversation for today. And this might be a function of your time and availability.
Although, may I just respond to what you've just said?
Yeah.
Or if you're going to go in
another please direction. Go ahead. Please go
and
ahead.
That is, I appreciate the correction. That yes, I mean it's in the West that we would typically review Socrates as the first political philosopher, but there's other traditions, interestingly, a number of which were close to concurrent with what was happening in ancient Greece, and some preceded it, as you've said. But one thing I'd like you to spend at least a couple minutes on is we're agreeing that philosophy is this indispensable resource for addressing racism and related issues. And you and I know our education is primarily focused on Western philosophers, I think even more mine than yours. And a lot of these philosophers were either they ignored race or they were implicitly racist. And in more than a few cases, they were explicit racist.
Explicitly racist, yes.
And yet, when we're talking about these concepts of justice and freedom and power and all the rest, we were saying that, among others, Hobbes and Locke and Machiavelli and Plato and so many others can provide these critical resources, and yet they were, again, I mean, often something other than, well, hardly any of them would be described as anti-racist in the strong sense. So just that, I mean, I wonder to what extent are you mindful of that? I mean, do you find yourself reaching for this canon of white philosophers?
Yes.
To address racism, even though they were often racist themselves. So talk about that and the related question of the extent to which you found it necessary to draw upon philosophers of color or from other traditions, whether historical or contemporary.
Well, thanks for asking that question. It's something I struggle with a great deal myself. But I think I've come to some kind of reconciliation, and I think a method that works for me, so to speak. As you pointed out, I am a bit of a hybrid. I was born in India. I grew up. I did my first degree there, but my philosophical education is almost entirely, in fact, it is at American institutions. I'm largely Western educated, and if somebody was to say, "What's your philosophical orientation?" I would say I was trained as an analytical philosopher. Quine, Davidson, Wittgenstein. I'm a 20th century analytical philosopher. But at the same time, it's in that very tradition that I found the critical tools I needed. For example, Quine's Do Dogmas of Empiricism. I often say most analytical philosophers don't appreciate just what a radical piece it is. And I think, when you take Quine's contributions, the indeterminacy of translation, ontological relativity, if you look at his radical views on ontology, I often say Quine is a postmodernist because he's just so radical about what can go. Because he is, this is where sort of pragmatism and postmodernism come together. They give you these very, very radical, critical tools for evaluating and understanding concepts. Pragmatists insist concepts must have cash value, that concepts have a teleology, that they work and they are devised and they are plastic and they evolve over a period of time, given their application to concepts. The things that exist in the world are things that our best theories need to be true. These are very radical claims. And they're so radical that they give us the conceptual tools to undermine almost any ideological claim.
Right.
So I really found, and I experienced this very early in graduate school, that I was in the presence of very, very radical thought. And because one of my first professors was a feminist philosopher, Virginia Held, my approach to political philosophy and to the canon right from the beginning was critical. And I was always noticing two things. One, how do they treat women? Two, how do they treat other cultures and other cultures and I would say groups of people? So, all my philosophical readings, they all have these blind spots. Aristotle talks about slaves and barbarians, and Hume talks about the Negro, and Hegel talks about, Schopenhauer's an anti-Semite, and Frege's an anti-Semite. So the history of Western philosophy is littered with racist, sexist, and anti-Semites.
Right.
But at the same time, I am perfectly willing to be a philosophical magpie. If I have broken into the house of, imagine myself as a serf raiding, the landlord's house during one of our rebellions. If I break into the landlord's house and I find there tools and weapons, which I can use against the landlord himself, I will use it. I will not decline the landlord's gun that is lying on the table and say, oh, this gun belonged to a racist, to a feudal lord, so I won't use it. No, it's a tool. I'll use it, and I'll use it to actually continue my revolt and my rebellion. So I think of myself as a philosophical magpie. I will build a home for myself, and I will build a home for myself taking the resources from whichever tradition works for me, so long, and this is a kind of a philosophical standard I place upon myself, that I'm not wrenching thoughts out of context and doing damage to the systems that they are part of.
Right.
And as it were, not picking and choosing in a way that results, hopefully, in a philosophically incoherent system. I'm quite prepared for my philosophical system to be inconsistent because, I am inconsistent. Like Whitman, I harbor within me many inconsistencies and many contradictions.
I think Nietzsche said the will to integrity is a lack of, the will to consistency is a lack of integrity or something.
Yes, exactly. It's a kind of a, it's a part of the old, maybe perhaps the old religious drive within us. So I think really of these traditions as being a kind of bounty. I think that the Western tradition, the Indian tradition, the Chinese tradition, these are bounties for me to draw upon. These traditions have within themselves their own problems. For example, Manu, who is, the great Indian lawgiver, is regarded by Indian feminists as irredeemably sexist, right? There are many aspects of Chinese philosophy that might be thought to be excessively conservative, too deferential to authority. But at the same time, when I was teaching Confucius and Mengzi last semester, my students were just, absolutely rapt because discussions of virtue ethics, they make virtue ethics into a matter of practice, into a matter of getting right over a period of time. And I was able to tell them that, it is part and parcel of Mengzi that we're never going to get this right. So if we're never going to get this right, and we're always trying on tools for size, and we're always encountering empirical realities which are thrown up by this very dynamic world of ours, then I think our philosophy should be correspondingly flexible, sympathetic, and as it were, willing to draw upon where we find these resources. So I draw upon Aristotle for virtue ethics. I draw upon Plato for at least an acute understanding of what the relationship between knowledge and truth might be, even though I might reject it. It stands as a certain kind of, perhaps, a kind of epistemic excess that I'm not willing to commit, right? I draw upon, people like, Locke, for instance, a great political philosopher, but one who had a very diminished view of the colonial subject, who thought that, in fact, liberal political thought only applied to colonizers, not to the colonized. So I'm perfectly willing to say, you know what? I'll take Locke, but I'll add the colonized to it. And I'll just, I'm willing to use the same limits of power. Lockean theories of property, which form the basis of Anglo-American systems of property. Well, if Anglo-American systems of property are so insistent upon using Lockean formulations, well, guess what? I've done a closer reading of Locke and found out that Locke himself undermines these understandings that our modern intellectual property lawyers would want to put on it, right?
Right.
So
Right.
I think my attitude is I will take on these traditions, I will evaluate them, I will see how they work for me in my life's problematics. And if needed, I might make a few adjustments to them, a little tinkering around the edges to fit them to my unique situation.
Right.
And I think that's where my overall approach to this lies.
That's really helpful and quite powerful. I think two things I would just note briefly is, of course, part of what you're talking about is the important intellectual exercise of reading a Locke and understanding their conception of property, and then knowing that they were, at the least, they were supportive of colonialism in a variety of ways, and then saying, well, to what extent is that sort of that colonialism inextricable from that theory of property or not? And of course, that's a debate, and there's some people who say it is, and others say no, it's not necessarily sort of a colonial conception, even though it happened to be that he was colonial. So that's it's as you're doing, that's part of what you're doing. In consulting and drawing upon the Locks and whoever else.
And you can really think of it as a kind of a patchwork, a kind of a collage, a kind of the way that Burroughs, William Burroughs talked about doing this kind of patchwork where you would cut up pieces from these little pieces of paper and then put it together to make up your own work. So I want Locke's theory of mixing property with land, but recognizing that the land is not fallow when it comes to artistic productions. Right. I like Locke's theory of land, and I want to take from it the part where he says, use only as much as I need for myself and leave enough over for everybody else.
Right.
So one of the things I want to do is to, and this is where the philosophical and perhaps even the scholarly perspective comes in, read more and read more carefully, and don't just settle for sound bites. Don't settle just for Adam Smith's invisible hand, but instead read the ethical content of his theory, which in fact Amartya Sen brings out beautifully in his lectures on ethics and economics. And I think also when you read within the philosophical tradition, there are resources that help us understand these perspectives across time and space. For example, if you read Isaiah Berlin on Giambattista Vico, Vico makes a great deal of this idea that separated by time and space, by history, we really need to engage in an act of acute imaginative reconstruction to place ourselves in the perspectives of those who wrote these terms or wrote these works, and to try and understand where they might have been coming from. Perhaps irredeemably racist, yes, sure, but in some sense, by putting ourselves in their place, understanding what their context was, being in a better position to see what within it will work. First and foremost, I'm a pragmatist. For tools, there are problematics that I'm confronted with at every single step in my life, and I'm looking for tools. And if those tools come from certain kinds of sources and they don't sully me by my use of them, then I will use them. That's my philosophical orientation in perhaps its most basic sense.
Yeah, and it's so clear that you've done that quite effectively. Final just observation I'd like to add in this conversation, just in terms of this question about the Aristotles and the Humes and whatnot and their views on race and gender, is to me, I draw lessons from that also. That's instructive also. One, I like to think that if they were true philosophers, had someone come along and really challenged their views on race and gender, they would have engaged and perhaps changed their mind.
Yes.
Another thing to me that's useful to keep in mind is, for all their brilliance, Aristotle and Hume had these incredible blind spots.
Yes.
And part of that, what that means is the need for everyone, despite their brilliance, to really be seeking new perspectives, whether new philosophers or just new perspectives more broadly, to fill out those blind spots. Because we see the Aristotles and the Humes were, for all their brilliance, just embarrassingly, in some cases, right, simplistic and crude in their beliefs in certain areas. And one would hope that if they'd been confronted and engaged, they would have overcome. that blind spot and
certainly hope.
and revise their position.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's very important in terms of humility. You know, we as students of philosophy, we are introduced to these people as our ancestors, our intellectual precursors. We admire them, and sometimes I think of Dummett. Michael Dummett finding out that Frege was an anti-Semite, and I'm like, okay, you were shocked and appalled and stunned, but also, as an educated man, you should have known that 19th century Germans are unlikely to be, sympathetic to what you might call, Semitism. So I think there's a sense in which it makes us place our idols in a less exalted light. They all have these blind spots. I mean, I admire Schopenhauer tremendously as a philosopher, but the man was a misogynist and an anti-Semite. I admire many philosophers, over the ages, and when you read their biographies, something I'm not sure we should do sometimes, you find out all sorts of political faults and personal faults. But of course, those are present in me as well. I mean, the impression you would get of me from my wife would be a very different one than you would get from my readers or my students, right? Because she's exposed to me warts and all. So I think when we realize that, man is this fascinating blend of the intellectual and the emotional, and we realize that the two sort of, blend into each other, we shouldn't expect completely emotion or affect-free thought, and we shouldn't expect completely, as it were, unguided or sort of misshapen affect either. And I think by seeing these folks as human beings, they're human beings. They're in particular times and spaces and locations, and they're limited. They didn't know as much as we did in some dimensions. They didn't have the same orientation towards the world. This often happens to me in, for example, the Indian intellectual and philosophical tradition, where I'll be having some argument or some discussion with somebody who is, with some Indian, and he'll say something like, oh, all the great wisdom is contained in our great scriptures from 5,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. I said, let me tell you, if those sages that had written these great works, the Upanishads and the Vedas, if they came down here today to our planet, and they found you citing their works as the ultimate authority on everything, they would say, you're a bunch of fools. You're a bunch of idiots. We wrote these books 5,000 years ago. What have you been doing since then? Right? What have you been doing since then? You are not our intellectual descendants. You're a bunch of lazy fools. You need to move on and use our work as springboards, or perhaps as parts and foundations of other systems of thought. Those works are testimony to human inquiry at that stage. It should cause us to have respect for human thought, but to also place it in its proper position. I think that mixture of humility and respect is something we need to take to our past as well, so that we can look forward to our future with, a kind of a measure of both, I think, optimism as well as some kind of modesty. Because we will always be creatures of our time. Right. 300 years from now, people are going to be coming up with funny internet memes based on all the stupid things that we said. Right. If there is an internet or a meme even.
Well, this is perhaps a good note to end on, in that one of the two things I've appreciated in this dialogue, among others, is that, it's pressed me and helped to peel back my blinders further in a few areas, but also the springboards you're talking about. I mean, I'm feeling energized and inspired to keep thinking about these things and to realize things I need to think more about. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thanks for having this conversation, John. It's actually, I've always said that, to my students and to whoever asks me questions, or when we get into these discussions, that the engaged conversation is the genuinely productive philosophical conversation. So thank you very much for that. And I'm actually hoping that we can have more of these conversations down the line.
I would hope so.
All right. Thank you very much, John. And I look forward to conversing with you real soon again.
Good. Thank you.
Bye, John. Cheers.